Acts 28, verse 2 from the KJV. And the barbarous people showed us no little kindness, for they kindled a fire and received us, every one, because of the present rain and because of the cold. There was a sturdy cargo ship, and last time we looked, it was about the size of this sanctuary. It was sailing through the Mediterranean Sea en route to Rome. On board was tons of wheat and 276 people, most of which were prisoners. Some were military soldiers, and others were there to manage the cargo. It was winter. It was a really unwise, unsafe time to travel by sea. It was there that the ship met, and all that it was carried met with a violent storm. I want you to imagine it, a violent storm. See, because some of you get anxious in driving in the rain in Southern California, right? Some of you get anxious driving in the sun in Southern California. Because yes, driving in the rain can be dangerous. People get in car wrecks way too often. Imagine sailing through the Mediterranean Sea in the winter, in this storm. There were no street signs. There were no shoulder to pull over in the middle of the sea. That doesn't exist. There was no radio. There was no radar. There was no sonar. There was not even a compass. Not even a compass. The tempest storm was so considerable that neither the sun nor the moon nor the stars were visible for weeks. Weeks. They couldn't read the skies. They couldn't read the skies to help them navigate or figure out even which direction they were headed. They became utterly, totally, completely shipwrecked as a consequence. And only by the hand of God, the lives of all 276 people on board were spared. Because of Paul, the apostle of Jesus Christ, he held on to the promise that he would reach his destination. That was the promise that God gave to him. And we read about that, God saving 276 people in the previous chapter. When they escaped the wreckage and the violent sea, they found a refuge in the island of Malta. How many of you have been on an island before? A few of you. Yeah, this was a very small island of Malta, present-day Malta. And it's there on this little island that Luke describes the kind of people that they met there. In verse 2, and the barbarous people. The barbarous people, as Luke labels them. Other translations may say, and if you look in your translation, it might say native, the native people. But actually, the KJV, barbarous, is the literal translation of the term that Luke uses. The word barbarous immediately gives us, the modern-day reader, a particular impression of the cruel, savage, uncivilized, uncultured, barbaric type of people that would have been on that island. However, that is not the way that the word was defined in the time that Luke wrote it. In Luke's day, the Greeks called anybody who did not speak their language as barbarians. It didn't mean the things that we think of barbaric, but simply those whose speech was unintelligible to the Greeks. It was actually a patronizing, condescending term that they used for anybody who wasn't like us. That's what they called people, barbarians, barbarous. And it was these barbarians that showed 276 individuals no little kindness. In other words, it was a big kindness. The NIV says it was an unusual kindness. Other translations say it was an uncommon kindness. The NASB says it was an extraordinary kindness. Luke is saying there are some people who are kind, some people who are courteous, and they should be. Just like if I visit any of your homes, naturally you'll offer me something to drink and maybe a snack. Those are the commonly kind people. You are all very kind in a common way. But these barbarians showed us a big, uncommon, extraordinarily generous kindness. Did you know that the Bible places a very high value on a character trait that all of us Christians should exhibit. And that trait is generosity. Generosity. Now, here's what happened when I just said the word generosity. You all immediately thought of what? Money. You all immediately thought of money. When you hear the word generosity, we think money. According to the Bible, generosity is certainly not less than being generous with your money, but it's quite a bit more. It's not less than being generous with your money, but generosity is quite a bit more. In Isaiah 32, chapter 8, which Joji read last week before we took the offering, but generous people plan to do what is generous, and they stand firm in their generosity. There's no talk of money there. No talk of money in that scripture. Generosity is something much more radical than just giving your money. Generosity should be something so deep, so consuming, so pervasive in every part of our lives. And money is only a part of generosity. Money is only a part of generosity. In fact, the word generosity itself, it comes from a Latin meaning of noble birth, fine personal qualities, high moral principles. The root word is the same as the word Genesis, genealogy, gentry, and even genius. It's something pure, something innate, something deep inside you from the very heart of the person that you might be. Generosity. Now, why is this worth noting? Why is generosity of these barbarians so important for Luke to make note of in his church history? Throughout the past 6 years that I've been studying the book of Acts, all throughout the 30-plus compressed years of church history and Paul's life recorded in the books of Acts, Luke has been making note of the stinginess, the hearts of rulers and kings and the religious mob, how stingy their heart was. Paul faced the religious mob often. Nearly 100% of the time, instead of exercising a generous heart, they took things away from Paul. We've seen that in this series. People who would never give, there's a word closely related to generosity. People who would never give Paul a break. They never gave him a fair trial. They never gave him an ounce of grace. Religious people gossiped and they rumored about Paul. They took his reputation and they ruined it for him. They threw Paul and Silas in prison for doing good. They took years of his life away. Their hearts were hard. They even plotted to take his very life. It really puts our problems in perspective. You think the people in your life are a bother? You think that the rumors and gossip and the he said, she said drama in your life is draining and disappointing? Think about the people that were constantly harassing and ruining Paul's life. I'm talking about devout people, religious people who memorized and preached scripture and gave tithes and gave their offerings to the temple. They were people just like you and me. See, it's very possible to be technically generous with your money, but not at all generous in your spirit or in your heart. It's very possible to be technically generous with your money, but not generous at all in your spirit or in your heart. And in the final chapter of Luke's writings here, he purposefully contrasts the closed heart of the religious people against the extravagant generosity of these barbarians, which puts us Christians to shame. The people in the great city of Jerusalem who had much spiritual advantage, they harassed Paul. But the barbaric people on the small, insignificant island who had little spiritual advantage, they showed much care and tremendous generosity. This demonstrates our particular truth. Often in the places where you least expect generosity, you received an abundance of it. But in the place where you ought to receive generosity, you receive very little of it. I'll say that again. It's often in the places where you least expect the generosity that you receive in abundance. And in the place where you ought to receive generosity, you receive little of it. And we'll look at that. You remember, it was the Samaritan who was generous to help the robbed, the beaten traveler who was left for dead, the Levite, the priest. They did not give him any aid. This is the experience of Paul and Luke. Jesus taught this truth many, many times over. He knows it's possible to be generous with your money, but not a generous-hearted person. And Luke took detailed note of Jesus' teaching as he wrote his gospel account. In Luke 18, verse 9, Jesus tells a parable, a story, a teaching point. To some who are confident of their own righteousness and look down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and says, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. When you and I hear the word tax collector, it's not necessarily a very unpleasant term. We're okay with it. It doesn't give us like the warm, fuzzy feelings inside, but we're okay with it. However, in Jesus' time, when Jesus was telling this story, tax collector was a terrible term. Tax collectors were Jews hired by Rome to extort enormous taxes from their kinfolk. They called them taxes, but really it was the spoils of war. They were taking the bulk of the wealth from everybody in the region and transferring it over to Rome. Therefore, the tax collectors were hated by their people because they were collaborating with the enemy. It would be like how if we would feel if we saw anybody collaborating with ISIS. That's the kind of hatred that people had. They were loathed. And why? Money. Rome would tell these tax collectors, our taxes are this much, X amount, and that's how much belongs to us, but you take what you want for yourself. And taxes were taken at spear point. It would be like if somebody came in and said, you owe us the government taxes with a gun to your head. You have our spears and weapons and soldiers behind you, so take as much as you want as long as we get what we need. They became tax collectors because they wanted money. They put up with the hate because of their love of money. Tax collectors were terribly and enormously greedy and wealthy. The other person in this parable is called a Pharisee. Now, when you and I think of Pharisee, we find that to be a very negative term. But in Jesus' time, it wasn't that negative. Pharisees were a reformed movement. The Sadducees were the religious officials and had been known for becoming corrupt. They weren't devout. They didn't even believe in the resurrection. And so the Pharisees came along, and they were incredibly devout people. They studied the Bible, they believed it, and they obeyed it to the very minutest detail, including in verse 12, I give a tenth of all I get. He gives a tenth of his money away to charity. And that's a lot. In 2017, the average American gave 2.6% of their money away to charity. And the U.S. is the most charitable nation worldwide. 2.6 was the average amount. 10% is a lot. The Pharisee was a devout person, charitable and giving, philanthropic. He cared about the causes he gave to and the people it impacted. He was an admirable person in society. So here we have two people. We have one incredibly greedy tax collector and the other incredibly philanthropic and charitable. But Jesus is looking underneath. He's looking at the condition of their heart. He's looking at the generosity of your heart. That's a theme throughout all of Scripture. God looks not at the heart. We look and see how much, wow, so-and-so gave so much. The other person is taking so much. But Jesus looks deeper. He looks at the heart. Look at this philanthropist, the pillar of the community. Look at his prayer. He starts off by saying in verse 11, God, I thank you. So you would think he would start to list things that he is thankful to God for. He would start to list things that God has done for him. But no, instead of acknowledging all the things God has given him, he begins to list everything that he's given others, as if God and everyone else should be grateful to him. He's praying about himself. He's praising and adoring and glorifying himself. And he looks down on everyone else. He looks down on everyone else. So, here's a person with an open wallet, but a closed heart. A person who is technically generous with money, but in his heart, he's tight, he's selfish, and he's proud. Here's a person in today's terms who would probably give a lot of money away, as much as 10% or even sacrificially, even more. And he really gives, and he really means it. And yet he still expects something in return. He expects a lot of praise. He expects acknowledgement and thanks. And the people to whom he gives, he kind of controls them a little bit because he gave them a lot of money. He gave you a lot of money. He should be able to tell you what to do, how to do it, what to do with it. And he technically and actually will hold a grudge. He holds things over people. I did this for you, so you owe me. He never admits that he's wrong because he did the right thing technically. He was generous with his money, but not radically generous in his heart or of his character. And on the other hand, you have the tax collector, or something very different is happening. Whereas the Pharisee stood up in front of everyone, in front of the temple to pray to himself, it says, but the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. God, have mercy on me, a sinner. You know what he's asking for? He's asking for God's generosity. Not God's money, but God's generosity. See, you can't measure someone's generosity only by how much money they give away. Money is only one type of currency, and there's more than one type of currency. Okay, then what is currency? Currency is a way to exchange value. And there's more than one type of way to exchange value. There's more than one type of currency, more than one type of way. See, if you're radically and pervasively generous, beginning with your heart, you will be generous not only with the currency of money, but in every currency of your life, in every area of your life. So what are these other currencies? Here are a few. Let's talk about the currency of emotional space. The currency of your emotional space. There are some people who will easily and happily give money, they'll write a check, but don't ask them to get personally involved. Don't ask them to get personally involved. They don't want to get personally involved. They don't want to get to know people. They don't want the emotional drain that comes with getting to know people and having all your friends around you draining you, talking with them and getting emotional with them. They don't want to share their personal, emotional space. They are private people. You see, their privacy is more valuable currency to them than their money. Their privacy is more valuable currency to them than their money. You give your money and you tell yourself you're generous. But if you're not willing to give your privacy away when required, you're not generous, not radically generous. You're holding on to the most important currency in your life. I fall in that category. In fact, I fall in all these categories we're going to go through. You might find yourself falling in one of these. Emotional space. Another currency is your physical space. Do you let people into your home? And do you let people into your things? You say, I'll write a check, but don't sit in my seat. That's mine. That's my place in the pew. You may not say it out loud, but in your heart, you're thinking it. In your mind, you're thinking it. Are you open to helping and being hospitable to those who need help? Are you like the Good Samaritan, or are you like the Levite and the priest? Your physical space is important to you. I'll give an offering, but that's my table over in the fellowship hall. Why does so-and-so think they are sitting at my table? That's my space. That's my family. That's my friendship. That's my circle of friends. Do you invite the stranger into your space? You'll give to help a cause, but when you walk past the homeless person who's sitting under the freeway and you even avoid making eye contact with them, you are not being a generous person, a generous heart with your physical space. Your physical space has become the more valuable currency than your money. A parable regarding this is found in Luke 14. Again, Luke is all over this. The great banquet. Jesus tells the story of the master who's throwing a great dinner party. And what happens? All the distinguished guests that have been invited, they make excuses. For some reason, they can't go. Some excuse. So the master tells his servant, go out and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind and lame, and all those on the roads and under the freeways, bring them in. Bring them in, compel them to come in. He doesn't say invite them in. He says bring them in, compel them to come in verse 21 and 23. You know why he says bring them in, compel them? Don't invite them, bring them in. Because in those days, in that culture, you would never accept an invitation to a party or a dinner or a gathering unless you could reciprocate the invitation. You couldn't accept the invitation unless you could invite that person back to your place. The invited, they made excuses, but the real reason they didn't want to go, I don't want to go to his home because then I'll have to invite that master into my space, and I don't want him in my space. And here the master says, don't even invite the poor and the needy, just bring them in. I want them here. The generosity of the master wasn't expecting anything in return. There's no way you and I can ever repay or reciprocate the master's invitation. There's no way. We cannot repay the master's invitation, his welcoming. Which brings me to a third type of currency. Relational currency. Relational currency. Most of us keep accounts in our relationships, and you don't realize it. There are two kinds of people that owe you. One kind are those people that you've done a lot for. You've done a lot for those. You helped them out. You've done a lot for them. You were there for them in this time and that time. So they kind of owe you. They kind of owe you. They have to reciprocate and help you out with this favor. And they have to be kind to you because you did a lot for them. The other kind of people that owe you are people who have wronged you. They harmed you or they done bad to you. These are people that owe you. These are people that you expect certain things from, and even you hold it over. You hold it over them. And what happens is something will go wrong in those people's lives. And you'll say, yeah, they had it coming. That's what they get. They deserve that. That's God's justice. And you start rooting against them. You start chatting, you start gossiping, and you start telling everyone what they did to you. So, because that's what they get. That's justice. They are paying for what they did wrong to you. That's not justice. That's vengeance. You need to forgive. It's a valuable currency. In Luke 17, verse 3 and 4, so watch yourselves. If your brother or sister sins against you and you rebuke them, and if they repent, forgive them. Even if they sin against you 7 times in a day, and 7 times come back to you saying, I repent, you must forgive them. Watch yourselves. Very interesting way to start this passage. The word forgive in this passage here is a very specific word. There are a few words that could be used for the word forgive, but here, the word forgive is basically saying to release a person from a financial debt. To release a person from a financial debt. That is what the word forgive here means. When you release a person or a loan from a loan or a debt, what happens? If you lend a person $1,000 and that person owes you and you say, I forgive you, what happens? You eat that $1,000. You're not getting it back. You surrender your right to repayment and you pay the debt yourself. If that person doesn't pay you, you absorb the loss. That's what happens. And most of our conflicts with other people aren't over money. People haven't necessarily robbed you of money, but they've robbed you of happiness. They've wronged you regarding your reputation or gossip. They've robbed you of joy, and they owe you. How do you forgive? You forgive, 2 words. Forgive, a compound word, by foregoing seeking your repayment from the other person. They no longer owe you. They no longer need to pay for their wrongdoing. You have forgiven them. Well, you say, I can't forgive that person. I can't absorb the wrong that they did to me. They owe me. They owe it to me. Or they deserve what they're getting. They're getting repayment for what they've done. Not me. I'm the good person here. I haven't done anything wrong. I've only done good. And like the Pharisee, we start listing all the good things we've done. Oh, well, isn't it wonderful that I fast twice a week, that I tithe my income, I read the Bible, and I obey it? Here's what you're saying. God should thank me. That person should be thanking me. God, you owe me this. I've been living a good life, so you owe it to me to bless me. You owe it to me to listen to my prayers. You owe it to me to make that person pay for the way they wronged me, because I'm your righteous devotee. The moment you start telling God, because I've lived a good life, God owes me, people owe me respect, God owes me this blessing in answer to that prayer, in that moment that you tell God and it comes out of your heart, you are a servant acting like a master. A servant acting like a king. You refuse to forgive, you are a servant acting like a king. You are forgetting who you are. God is king. He created you. He sustains you. He holds everything together. He doesn't owe you anything. You owe him everything. And when you turn to someone else and you keep accounts, refusing to forgive and forego repayment, and you say, I can't forgive this person because of what they did, you are a servant acting like a king. You are putting yourself in the judge's seat. You are playing judge, and you're saying, it's my right to talk about them behind their back because of what they did to me. They deserve it. How do you know what they deserve? Are you God? Do you know what they've been through? Do you know all things? If you cannot forgive someone, if you are keeping account and holding grudges, if you apply a prejudice, if you are malicious and you gossip and you're rooting against people and you are not being radically generous, pervasively generous, you are a servant acting like a king. And the only way to get out of this backwardness, this twistedness, this warped mindset of servants acting like kings is to see the beauty of the king who became a servant. You will never be able to forgive people's tiny, small debts against you until you see Christ dying on the cross and paying your great debt. That's what Jesus is saying. If someone sins against you 7 times, the number of fullness, 7. If someone sins against you the most deepest and full way anyone could ever sin against you, forgive them. And the disciples responded, increase our faith, which is basically a way of saying, that's impossible. That's impossible. We can't believe in even doing that. And then Jesus says in verse 6, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed. He's not talking here about exercising faith to do wondrous works, but he's talking about your understanding of what you believe. He says, if you even had a little smidgen of understanding of the enormous generosity of God to pay your great debt of sin, this tree, this mulberry tree that has grown into a count you've been holding against other people will just disappear and be absorbed. You'll never stop being a Pharisee who looks down on others. You'll never stop being a judge of others until you see the judge of all the universe getting out of his judgment seat to come down, to go to court, to be tortured and killed for you in your place. The barbarians of this little island of Malta didn't judge anyone on that shore. Remember, there wasn't just one or two people on that shore. It wasn't just Paul and Luke. There were 276 homeless people who survived that shipwreck. Most of them were criminals. Not just any criminals, but probably criminals who were awaiting execution in Rome. We would go to juvenile hall in LA around Christmas time, arranged by a Lionel uncle. And me, Anderson, and Lionel uncle, we would go once a month on a Sunday to do a small service there, and where I would actually be teaching on these parables in Luke. And Lionel uncle, he probably still goes there about once a week, if not more, to minister to these kids there. And before entering the juvenile hall, Chaplain Reuben would say to us, these kids have done bad things. That's why they're here, because they've done wrong. But that doesn't matter to you. What matters to you is sharing the warm love of Christ with them. That's what you're here to do. Not to judge them, but to love them. Your work is to show the radical generosity of Christ. That's your work. That's my work, to show the radical generosity of Christ. And how do we do that? A few practical things right here in this verse Luke tells us to do. For they kindled a fire and received us everyone because of the present rain and because of the cold. One practical way: let people into your physical space. The barbarians kindled a fire for 276 people. That's either a huge bonfire or they invited people into their homes and kindled that fire, which I think is more likely. Luke says right here, it was cold. It was a rainy winter season. You can't have a fire that big in the winter rain. They brought in not their friends, but strangers. People that had nothing to offer them in return. People that you have yet to know. You bring them in because you love them without thought of return. Like the master throwing a dinner party without any thought that these people can repay me. These people would reciprocate the invitation. No, you did it because you love them. That is generosity. Loving your neighbor. Who's your neighbor? That's right. It could be your colleague. Could be your literal neighbor who lives right next to you, or the person on the street. Jesus said it's the Samaritan, meaning the person you despise. Because somebody asked that question, who is my neighbor? And he said it's the Samaritan. The person you despise the most. That's what it meant to that person. Inviting them into your physical space. That may be your home. Or it could be your favorite restaurant. It could be just your literal physical space, and you make contact with them. You look at them, and you become a source of warmth for them. Be generous with your physical space. Second, you can let them in your emotional space. 276 people crashed on the island for 3 months. 3 months they were there, marooned on this island. And the people of Malta, they had their privacy invaded. They had their privacy invaded. You know, if someone comes to visit you for a week, we can manage. But after a week, it gets a little annoying, right? And everything they say, everything they ask, and everything they do hurts you. I had my own bathroom for 8 years. And suddenly, somebody came in and I had to start sharing again. 3 months. That's an emotional investment. 3 months is an emotional investment. Third practical thing we can do. Receive each person as they are. That's what these barbarians did. Too often, we are really cold towards people, especially in LA. You go to the deep south, they have a certain hospitality You go to India, there's a certain hospitality with your neighbor, but in LA, you don't even look at the person when you walk past them. That's what Luke is saying here. It was winter, it's cold, it's rainy, it's a cold world. And you go through seasons like that. Are you going to be cold-hearted to those in need, or are you going to be a source of warmth? Are you going to be a judge, or are you going to be a servant? You are not the judge. You are a servant redeemed by a radical and generous king. Paul was assaulted by the Jews and assisted by the barbarians. Christ was accepted by the common people and rejected by rulers. The people of Malta were barbaric in their language, but they were fluent in the language of generosity and kindness. You may be generous in your giving, but you've been barbaric in your heart. You may have been generous in giving, helping, but in your heart, it's been barbaric. You give money, but your heart is stingy towards people, speaking slander, gossip, spreading lies, false truths, stretching the truth. I'm not talking to the person next to you. I'm talking to each one of us. I'm talking about you. Forget speaking, saying things. You've been judging people in your mind. You don't even have to say it. You've been not giving people the benefit of the doubt, reducing them to 1 or 2 or 7 things that they've done to you without forgiving. You may not speak the same language as a stranger. You may not speak Greek or Hindi or Tamil or Spanish or Arabic. They may not be like you, and you may not be like them. They may look different and seem barbaric because of how they have sinned and things they have done against you. But what is more barbaric in God's economy is your pride and your selfishness and your unforgiving, tight, closed heart. But you can speak the language of kindness and generosity and love. The same language Christ sings over you. The same language he's offered you at your rebirth. Are you speaking the language of love or hate? Are you speaking or snickering at people behind their backs, or are you loving them? Are you a gossip, or are you generous with how you talk about them? Are your thoughts in your heart malicious, or are they kind? Are you sowing discord or harmony? Are you being critical or complimentary? Are you forgiving or keeping accounts over people? This Mission Sunday, how will you radically be generous with what God has given you and what God has done for you? How will you be generous to the stranger and the one you've estranged? The book of Acts, it begins with a mission. You and I will be witnesses of the enormous generosity of God. You will be witnesses in Judea, your very home, in Jerusalem, among the body of believers, in Samaria, even among the people that you loathe, and to the uttermost type of person that you interact with who will be vastly different from you. I pray that our church and every individual in it would be radically generous, not only in what we give or what we say, but at the very root of who we are in our hearts.